Started. I'm going to drag and drop in the raw file that we're working with today, and that will automatically open up the Camera Raw interface. So you might be wondering what changes should be made in Camera Raw and which ones should be made in Photoshop. Camera Raw and other raw processors such as Lightroom work with the full raw information of the file, while Photoshop works with the rasterized file. I'll explain the difference. The raw file contains the largest amount of data that your camera can capture. It gives you the option to make significantly large changes in exposure and temperature. So, for example, under and overexposure can often be recovered in a raw processor. Once we are in Photoshop, the file is automatically rasterized. This discards all excess data, making the image much less flexible. We won't be able to make as significant of changes to the imported image without causing damage. So, the most important settings we'll want to adjust in Camera Raw are the exposure, including under and overexposure, as well as the temperature. In the raw settings, we can choose any temperature that we like. However, once the image is rasterized, changing the temperature will do significant image damage, which will be especially visible in the skin tone. Now, we could make more changes. There are other tools available in Camera Raw, such as HSL tools, split toning, all kinds of things that you're welcome to add onto your workflow. However, we are only going to run with the essentials today, so let's get started with that. First things first, we're going to set our white balance, and with white balance there are generally two possible approaches. Either we can try to find the accurate white balance. This is where white is actually white, so for example this white of the pages of the book, and green would be green, red would be red, and so on. And again, this is going to be accurate white balance. You'll probably find it, or something close to it, by hitting the auto on the white balance, or taking this white balance tool and selecting something that is perfectly white in frame. Okay, and then the other option for white balance would be choosing a stylized white balance. So for example, in this case, we shot this at sunset, so there's some backlight, a bit of a flare coming through here, so we could choose to go with something warmer. So we can, warm it up a little bit, add some yellow, add some magenta, and that would give us something more golden like this. However, at this point, everything will skew a little bit warm, so our greens are probably actually going to be a little bit more yellow, our reds are going to be a little bit closer to orange, and so on. Making a choice between accurate white balance and stylized white balance is completely up to you and really just depends on what sort of a final result you're looking for. So in this case, I'm going to go with a bit of a stylized white balance, so I'm going to swing this around kind of like a pendulum and decide where in the middle of that I kind of feel happy. So in this case, I'm going to set my warm to cool temperature at 6500, and then I'm going to set my tint as well. And I'm just going by eye here, and you'll continue to develop an intuition the more you set your own white balance. Okay, so this feels really balanced to me. It's a little bit on the warmer side, but the skin tone feels very neutral to me, and I'm happy with that. At this point, we can also check what it looks like before. Clearly, when we imported this, it had a very, very warm tint, so this must have been a camera setting, and I'm glad that we had the opportunity to show how to correct for something like that. In general, a good rule of thumb to go by is that if you're shooting any sort of daylight, it is unlikely that your tint will exceed -20 or +20. If you're way up here, that's probably incorrect. So generally, I try to keep it between 0 and 20 when I'm dealing with daylight, and that'll give me a good indicator of something to work off of to kind of match the temperature too. So let's move on from this. The next thing we'll want to work on is going to be the exposure and sort of the exposure distribution. To best do that, we're going to take a look at this histogram up here. All the way on the left side, we have the black point, and all the way on the right side, we have the white point. This is an indicator for black clipping. If we click it, then we should see any black clipping. There is currently none. And then on the right-hand side, we have the highlight clipping indicator, and if we click that, then we'll see all of this up here is technically blown out. There's no information here, it's just pure white. Okay, I'm gonna turn that back off. And then this is going to show us our exposure distribution of the image within that range of black all the way to white. So currently we have a lot in the shadows. We're definitely skewed a little bit to the left, as you can see. So we can slightly raise the overall exposure. And we can either do that with this slider here, and you'll see that graph up there move, of course, or we can also just grab, these sections. The middle one is going to be the exposure overall. And then here you'll have the shadows, the blacks, the highlights, and the whites, just like you have right here. These are the exact same controls. Okay, so I'm going to move up the exposure a bit overall, again, because we're skewed a bit to the left. So I'll just raise it about +20. Now we can try to move around the shadows a bit if we'd like to, move around the highlights a bit. But for this, we kind of want to just go by eye and see if we're losing information anywhere. The most important part is looking at the skin. And here's what I mean when I say losing information. I'm going to underexpose this. So here we don't have any detail in these shadows. It's just completely flat. That means we've lost information in the shadows. If we rasterize this image and bring it into Photoshop, we won't be able to bring these back. Same thing goes for overexposure. Something like this, you'll see that we might have skin detail right here, right? So we can see pore detail and all of that. However, over here, it's just flat white, so no detail. So that's bad, and that's something that we want to prevent. So in this case, I'll go back to my raised exposure of 0.2, and everything looks good to me in the skin. We're not losing any detail, but I do want to fix that we're losing some detail here in the hair. See, this is completely clipped. So what we can do if we don't want to move the highlights around overall, because that would affect the skin, is that we can use this adjustment brush over here. So I'm going to pull that up. The hotkey for it is K. And then that gives us an option to mask in an adjustment just like we would in Photoshop. In this case, I'm going to take the highlights down by 100%. And I will mask that onto the hair. And as you can see, that immediately brings back all that clipped information. So let's zoom into that and we can check the before and the after, and as you can see, now we have all this detail back. We can also change or dial back the adjustment or add to it by clicking on this little node and then making a change. So in this case, I'll set the highlights to -50. And then I will also add a little bit of that adjustment to these highlights up here, since some of those are clipped as well. Here you can adjust your brush settings. So in this case, I'm going to dial back my flow to maybe about 30, and that will make sure that I can just apply this gradually. So I'll apply it a little bit in these highlights and bring back just a bit of that information, but this is entirely optional. I'm also going to add this adjustment onto her arm and her skin. It's definitely important to consider that overexposure and underexposure are most important to fix in the skin and or the hair area. Meanwhile, areas such as this aren't as important because the information here isn't as valuable. So we can close this adjustment brush view by hitting K, and that'll bring us back to our base adjustments. Let's take a quick look at the before and after for our camera raw settings. And here's the before and the after. Much more balanced and clean. All the important information regarding our subject has been retained, so we're ready to import this file. Now let's take a quick look at our import settings. To do that, we'll click down here. If we're editing an image solely for web use, then we can work directly in the color space that we will be outputting to, which is sRGB. This is the color space that we use anywhere for digital and or web and platforms. Meanwhile, if we are considering using the image anywhere else, such as in print, then we might want to work in a slightly larger color space, for example, ProPhoto RGB, and then we can export to sRGB later. So in this case, I'll be working with a ProPhoto RGB workflow. The channel depth options are going to be 8 bits per channel or 16 bits per channel. In 8 bits per channel, we only have a limited amount of colors available. Once again, this is what we will be outputting to. However, if we're trying to work with a more full color range, then we should be working in 16 bits per channel and exporting to 8 bits later. Okay, so I'm going to set this to ProPhoto, 16 bits per channel, and I'm also going to select to open in Photoshop as a smart object. And I'll show you what that does in just a second. Let's hit OK and hit Open Object. Alright, so what the Smart Object permits us to do is to click on this Smart Object icon of our imported file, and that will reopen it straight up in our RAW processor, including having all of our settings dialed in, such as the adjustment brush setting, so that we can make any sort of changes to this. Say we want to add on to this highlight setting, we can make that change, and then apply those changes in our Smart Object. So that's pretty great. The one downfall is that it will take up a little bit more file space, so once you're happy with your RAW settings and you're ready to rasterize this and not make any more RAW changes, you can right-click this layer and hit Rasterize Layer, and that'll just turn it into a completely normal base layer. In this case, I'm just going to hang on to this information just in case we need it later.